Welcome all. I'm Rania Francoeur, and today's session is on building leadership for CFOs as part of our functional department leadership series. The format of these Q&A sessions is typically we have Randall Craig, CEO of the Brain Trust Professional Institute, get us started, and then we flip into questions. I have my questions I brainstormed. We have your questions. We'll see them in the chat. And Randall, as usual, is in the hot seat. He has no idea what's coming his way. So for those who don't yet know Randall, I'll share a bit about Randall. He's founded several successful startups. He's held a long-time position at a Big Four consulting firm. He was a senior executive at an American public company. He's the author of 8 books. In the Speaker Hall of Fame, he's a master facilitator. He's helped over 100 organizations scale, and he works with me at the Brain Trust Professional Institute, helping organizations grow through leadership coaching, executive coaching, leadership retreats, and facilitating conversations to align teams. So if you have any questions, the hour is yours. You can put it in the chat or anything else, but I'll have Randall kick us off with some ideas. Where do you want to start, Randall?
The whole theme is about, gee, you're a CFO and you aspire to be the CEO. My first question really would be, do you want it? And the reason why I ask that question is it's so often we think about the role as something we aspire to. You move up through the levels of, you're at the very top of your functional ladder, and what's next? And so, I just wanted to point out, first of all, that there's actually several different paths. You can be the CEO of the entire organization. You can be the CEO of a division or CEO of a different geography. You can be the CFO with more operational responsibilities. You can be a CFO at a larger organization or in a different industry. There's a whole bunch of different paths. But what's interesting is what you need to succeed in the first three are actually surprisingly similar. And I think that's a very, very interesting idea, because if you're able to do those things that you're needed to succeed, you're not limiting the career path, if you will. You're not limiting your career path in any particular way. So, to boil it down, you won't get the job unless you're already seen to be doing that job. Or if you flip it, you might get the job if you could demonstrate that you're capable of doing it, which then begs the question, well, how do you accomplish that? And the short version of that is that you've got to seek experiences that expose you to different aspects of the role. And that kind of leads to probably the second big question, which is, what's the job? How is the CEO role fundamentally different than any other role that is within the organization and outside of it as well? And I think that that's something that's actually worth exploring. So I can, why don't I just answer that one and be done with it rather than, everyone's got a job description, but this one's unique. Your decisions affect every single person in the organization. You're responsible for every single person in the organization. Even though you're a CFO, you kind of understand the idea of making sure that payroll actually, works, etc. As the CEO, your decisions affect whether people actually have a livelihood. Your strategic decisions do that at a bigger picture. Your tactical decisions have to do with individual livelihoods, etc. But that's very big. That's managing down in a certain sense. Managing up, you're responsible for the board and investors. All of a sudden, they're your number one audience in a certain sense. You need the complete confidence of the board and investors as well. And so, for the first time, there's a huge amount of like a magnifying glass on you and your role. I could say more about that as well. That's kind of managing up. Sort of managing sideways is interesting because you're in a very lonely place. There's nobody who's at your level within the organization, nobody with your responsibilities. You really have no peers. You've got to rely on external, for example, coaches, maybe peer groups, but those are kind of really outsiders. But it's a lonely existence in a certain sense. People read meaning into every single thing that comes out of your mouth, every single thing. So if you say something that's a bit off, people say, "Well, what so and so means is such and such." Certainly in my roles as CEOs over the years, I had no idea at the very beginning, the first CEO role that I had, that that indeed that people do hang on every single one of your words. A flippant remark, one way or the other, can lead to a whole bunch of dysfunction because people read into it, one thing or the other. Your job is to imprint your vision, or rather, well, your job is to imprint your vision on the organization. And everybody else's job is to understand what that vision is and help execute, make that actually happen. But all they've got really is their impression of what your vision is, even if you say it, which goes back to people tend to hang on every one of your words. And that's a kind of different experience. I think the job is very different as well, is because the focus probably for the first time is massively external. A COO's job is operations, CFO's job is finance, etc. I know for both those roles, there's an external component to it, a very important component to it. Chief marketing officer, chief HR officer, chief people, all these other ones, also there's an external perspective. But the CEO's job, while everybody is taking care of the organization inside, the CEO's job also has to be focused far more outside. For the first time, for example, you might be a PR spokesperson. For the first time, people are looking at you from a fundraising or capital markets perspective in a very different way. You may have a role that may be new in terms of lobbying or advocacy or for your organization. It also means that you can't be in the weeds. And even though you may have had um, um, some responsibilities, if you will, when you had a C-suite title, to be externally, you just can't afford to be in the weeds, because once you're in the weeds, people say, well, so-and-so said to do it this way. And you very, very quickly lose the opportunity to sort of empower the people to work with you and so on. It's very different. So, the job is actually fundamentally different. So then the question becomes, well, how do you actually get the experiences now when you're a CFO in order to be successful once you're in that CEO role? Which kind of goes back into that role, that question. You won't get the job unless you're doing the job, but you can't be doing the job if you're not in the job, right? So it's a very, very interesting thing. So I've got a whole bunch more comments, but why don't we sort of flip the questions so we could hear what other people are interested in hearing, and we can circle back to some of my comments as well later.
Okay, lots and lots to chew on there, Randall. I brainstormed my own questions here, which Randall has not seen before. So I'll ask one to get us started. I want to talk, you talked about in your opening remarks, do you really want it? Do you really want this job, and what are the other alternatives? So let's talk about that life cycle of the CFO. So a recent statistic revealed, Randall, that less than 50% of CFOs were in that role 5 years later. And after 2 years in the role, 20% had moved on. So these numbers are in part, influenced by M&A. After all, two companies, when they merge, don't need two CFOs. But do you have any insights there to share on that life cycle? Like what can they expect from their own careers?
So, I think the best part of being a CFO is that you get to look at every little corner of the business through a financial lens, sometimes some operational lens as well, but you get to see every single corner of the organization. You get to interact with every functional area because money is the oxygen of business. And so as a result of that, it's no surprise a lot of CFOs are asked to move into a CEO role. And I think that's a very exciting kind of thing for those. Others, on the other hand, say, well, my career path is to get deeper and deeper and deeper into this role, so I can have a greater intellectual challenge, a greater professional challenge, getting deeper into the role of CFO. Let me take on bigger and bigger responsibilities. Let me do more and more things, particularly with organizations that are in the midst of scaling. It's interesting because the role of the CFO, for example, for a private company that hasn't issued anything on the bonds market, but is just doing, say, private funding, is very different than a CFO of a large private company. And that's very different than the role of a CFO of a public entity, right? And so as the organization grows, the actual job of the CFO quite changes quite a bit. And that provides an awful lot of career satisfaction and challenge for a lot of people, which is why a lot of people see this as a great career. Others, on the other hand, are they want to exercise different muscles, right? In terms of leadership, guess what? You learn how to be a leader as a CFO. Well, gee, you get exposed to every part of the business. So the next logical step is up. Okay, so it's some of course become advisors and go into that side of the business and everything, and that's also an opportunity.
Randall, you are a big proponent of flexibility, open-mindedness, creativity, trying new things for companies to stay competitive. And when you work with organizations, you're quick to flag any policies that work counter-purpose to this, that, get in the way of employees being successful or affect employee motivation. Like, can you share like anything to come to mind for you of policies that you've seen that like inhibit the ability for the CFO to operate at full capacity?
Um, I don't think it's really policies in the sense that a CFO often is the one who's putting those policies in place, in terms of internal controls, in terms of you know, fraud, in terms of all those kinds of policies are in place just to allow guardrails to take place. I think the best CFOs recognize that these are designed to allow creativity, innovation, allow the movement, but still to protect the organization financially, right? And it's a dynamic thing. I really think it is. I don't think that's really something that encumbers a CFO. Because they're the ones who are frankly setting the policies, and they're also the ones that have the ability to bend the rules when necessary with as long as they've got their approvals. Where the challenge comes is with respect to regulatory guardrails, particularly for public companies or debt issuing private companies, where it might be that the Securities Exchange or a regulator will impose certain requirements that are very frustrating or very costly. And the question about how much should we put into compliance, for example, is one where it's tempting to say, well, maybe not so much. But on the other hand, it's also those exist for a particular reason. I also think, with respect to the banking system, they may also have certain things that are required from a reporting perspective and to make sure certain ratios are kept within certain bounds. Those are also I wouldn't say those aren't policies. Those are just covenants on loan agreements and banking arrangements. And those things also can be confining a little bit, right? But it's just part of the role of saying, okay, how do we make sure that we get as much flexibility as we can when these externally imposed rules sometimes make it difficult. In a certain sense, sometimes the CFO is really the great explainer to the rest of the businesses to what we can do and what we can't do because of it. So.
I'm happy to share, Randall. I have questions here. A lot of people just come to listen, which is totally fine. But if any CFOs here, aspiring CFOs, happy to have you pick Randall's brain. I'll ask the next question, Randall. You mentioned the CFOs can bend the rules. Okay, so let's look at perhaps a little bit of a seedy underbelly of the CFO world and ethics. One incredible survey that I found, global average, was that 40% of CFOs are willing to fudge the numbers to make things look a way that they are not 40%
Yikes.
when they felt confident that there would be a turnaround. So why expose these anomalies or these blips to cause alarm? They feel confident it's going to turn around. So they're going to smooth things over. Okay. Some countries had an average of 70% were willing to do this and felt this was the right thing to do for their companies. So you said yikes, Randall. So I think you've revealed how you feel about this. But what would your advice be if you were coaching a CFO? Like if this is sometimes you're in an industry and this is what's done. This is what's
Well,
done.
a lot of my coaching is with CEOs, as you know, Rania, and this is what I would suggest with to the CEO first. So I would say that if you've got a CFO that is willing to fudge numbers or do any of that kind of stuff, I'd fire them immediately. They would not have a place in my organization, and I just couldn't imagine most CEOs willing to sort of put up with that. I'm shocked by those numbers, and I think it's terrible. I also think, with respect to the various uh, accounting standards, organizations, and the ethical rules of the various CPA organizations as well, that would be a very, very bad thing and terribly offside. So to the CFOs, what I would say is if you start to think about where can we bend the rules, there's a line between what's unethical, what's illegal, or what is contrary to the accounting standards of the jurisdiction and the jurisdictions that your organizations operate on. You only have one sense of credibility, and if you're thinking about pushing it a bit too much, or really pushing it towards that line, you have to think about where that slippery slope goes. And I'd be very, very reticent about doing so. Now, that doesn't say anything about the fact that you might feel the pressure to do it for one reason or the other. And I think as a CFO, part of your job is not just to do the numbers. I think, any accounting, analyst level one can sort of do basic numbers. I think the job of the CFO is to make sure that the excuse me, that the other members of the senior management team understand the reasons why some of these things are in place and why isn't the organization's um, benefit to make sure that they're followed. I also think certainly for public companies, there's a public interest involved, and there's an audit committee that you also report to, usually independently of your role of reporting to the CEO. So there's also that. So I'm shocked by these statistics. I'm very disappointed in them. Certainly the CFOs I've worked with over the years are not in that category.
I agree with you. I think it's interesting because usually statistics, people answer these surveys what they think is the right answer, the noble answer. So for them to answer that they would be willing to do it demonstrates that they think this is what's expected of them. I thought that was quite shocking as well. Okay, you talked about the CEO. Let's introduce this character into our play here. Let's talk about the CEO CFO dynamic. On one hand, the CFO is the right hand of the CEO, and it makes the job much less lonely for CEO and CFO, as you said, if they are a good strategic partnership and can support each other and be a good sounding board to each other. And yet, it is very common behind closed doors, undercurrents, or open fires that there's turbulence in the relationship, particularly if the CEO feels out of their league and then they feel threatened by the CFO, who is often the obvious successor to the CEO. So, what advice would you offer a CFO to manage this common dynamic?
So I've seen some cases where there is that dynamic. I've also seen cases where it's absolutely not the case, where it truly is being one of partnership. Everyone kind of understands what their job is it to do. Most CFOs recognize that they're employed at the pleasure of the CEO. Okay, so there's that sort of dynamic. Number one, obviously, a CFO being let go is something that a board would be very interested in understanding why. That's a very, very bad sign. It usually is a signal that something is going on that's not so good. But the what I would say is that the job of the entire C-suite is to make the pie bigger for everybody. Okay, not just for the people in the C-suite, I should say, but the rising tide floats all boats. The CEO is so focused on some of the CEO jobs. They need somebody to literally walk behind them, okay, facing the other direction, helping sort of take care of the financial business, the management accounting business, the treasury, all the other CFO functions, so that they could do what they're going to be doing. One of the reasons why so many leadership groups do executive retreats and usually do them once a year is because this is where some of the relationships can be strengthened so that when one member of the C-suite speaks to the other, it becomes very easy as opposed to something where people are, you know, double guessing, if you will. Where the dynamic becomes a little bit tougher, in some leadership groups, the whole question of CEO succession is one where there's two or three candidates that are set up as possibilities, and they're all given greater and greater responsibility to see how they do, and sometimes there's an unhealthy competition between those potential successors. And that's not healthy. And that's the job of the CEO to make sure that if there is some degree of competition, it's a healthy competition, not one that's dysfunctional or terribly political, that it takes away from the job at hand. From the CFO's perspective, that particular role, manages the money and determines, has a big hand in determining budget allocations and the whole bit, right? And this is a very powerful position, right? And use it as a way to sort of um, make the pie bigger for everybody, okay? Or you can be dysfunctional, and eventually the chickens will come home to roost.
Sarah, I'll read your question. Thank you. What do you see as the biggest difference between being a CFO in a nonprofit versus a for-profit organization? Are there specific things to look out for if moving from one to the other? Good question.
Oh, yeah, it is, and it's actually two questions, okay? Um, Yeah, so first of all, in a not-for-profit, oftentimes the numbers are much smaller. The resources are a lot smaller. There's a whole volunteer aspect of it, and that means a whole different series of internal control issues. The boards sometimes are far less sophisticated, and therefore the types of questions and the reporting requirements are a lot less onerous, if you will. Um, Sometimes because not-for-profits don't have a pure profit um, um, mandate. The focus for success is, more balanced scorecard, for example, multiple different dimensions, not just purely the financial one. The better companies also look at ESG and other non-financial measures as well. But that's one of the bigger differences between them. Um, Not-for-profits often don't have enough. I shouldn't generalize. Not-for-profits often are very, very thin with respect to accounting help. So are there as many arms and legs to actually do the work? That's something that many not-for-profits that I've been involved with have struggled with. Sometimes the sophistication of the staff that you have, well, they've been around for like 30 years and they've always done our accounting or our payables or our bank reconciliations. And, they know all the members and they know all the donors, and so it's kind of hard to sort of say, well, we need somebody who can use, more sophisticated, say, treasury management tools or more sophisticated ARAP or whatever the particular task happens to be. And so that's kind of what the big difference is between them. Um, well, maybe I'll just mention one other as well. The executive director at a not-for-profit or CEO, whatever the title is, the president who's elected, okay, or is appointed, perhaps from the board, who may be a volunteer, and the staff, of which the CFO is one of them, all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of internal stakeholders that you may need to deal with that are different, right? So that's a bit of an interesting thing. If you sort of move from the not-for-profit to the for-profit world, who the stakeholders are going to be very different. What their expectations of you are will also be very different. And it could very well be that the arms and legs that you have are also very different, as well as your ability to hire and fire and change your team because the kind of not-for-profit, you know, I don't want to call it love and dimension, but the friendly dimension of the not-for-profit might be different in a corporate. So that's some of them that I've certainly seen. And I've been a CEO for most of my career, president of some not-for-profits and trade organizations, as well as obviously my own companies and all the people that I coach, the senior leaders that I coach. So that's what I've been able to see. I hope that's helpful, Sarah.
Talk to me about the relationship between CFO and HR or CFO responsibilities and HR responsibilities. In our line of work, we run into organizations where it's a joint function quite often and it works very well because then the needs of the team and the budget for employees, like it's all understood by the same role. Like, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And if you have a medium-sized organization, oftentimes the CFO has a whole bunch of operational responsibilities. There isn't a COO, for example. HR reports to finance, IT reports to finance. There could be some other operations that report to finance because, money makes the world go around. As soon as you go above X hundreds of employees, though, we start to see that being very different. And there's a chief people officer or chief HR officer or I don't think anyone calls it personnel anymore, right? So the dynamic is different. And at what point does an organization go from having a CFO that has a number of different responsibilities, including HR, to one where you have professionals in every single area is interesting. Because at the largest, 750 million to up, et cetera, each person in that C-suite should be truly an expert and a specialist in their particular area. Okay. When you sort of go down to the sort of scale ups, beyond startups, the scale up kind of zone, it could very well be that the person you have responsible for HR, even though they may even have the title Chief HR Officer, Chief People Officer, their knowledge base and their experience base may not be as senior as that as the CFO. So there's an interesting dynamic because sometimes the person responsible for people is a little bit more junior. They're there in a scale up because recruitment is number one and retention is, on the other hand, for a large organization, 750 million, billion, up, et cetera, the role encompasses quite a few things, right? And the complexity of managing that across multiple jurisdictions and multiple legal entities and multiple cultures and so on makes it actually very challenging to do that particular job, right? So you do need somebody who's truly a specialist in that, and they can't be in the weeds. They've got to be up doing strategic things, right? And that's something that a CFO can help with in terms of being the colleague, et cetera. And obviously they provide the budget that's needed for a lot of these things. Excuse me. But that's a very, very specific example. In the scale up kind of world, the question is, okay, how do we grow really, really fast? How do we make sure that we retain the people? How do we make sure that as people grow, their career path is one that we don't lose the best people, or we don't keep people in a particular role too long? Even some of the largest clients we've worked with, call it the billion plus crew, you've got people who've been promoted to roles that are more senior than frankly that they should be in. Yet, because they were on the boat when the tide was rising, they sort of had that title, even though they're not actually doing that. And sometimes this is the case with respect to the CFO. They've never been the CFO of, say, a public company or a very, very large multi-jurisdictional one with large regulatory issues. But they had the title and they need to be changed, right? And same thing with the chief people officer. Are they doing the job that they need to do? And the collaboration between the two of them, it can be very, very powerful. Or it can be one where everyone's stuck in their silos, right? And it's the job of the CEO to make sure that some of these things actually happen. By the way, sometimes coaching can help, right? Because we can upskill somebody. Sometimes it can be peer masterminds that can help this kind of thing. Sometimes it can be a common coach for two people to help them mediate sort of and learn how to work together. There's not that many people who've got that title in very, very large organizations, right? So it's why reinvent the wheel?
Lots to be unpacked there. You mentioned people who are over promoted and don't have the strategic mind that perhaps their new senior title demands. So, like, what if the CEO, they're concerned that the CFO is underperforming, right? Like, what would help you assess whether, you've over promoted what should be a controller or whether you need coaching? Like, how would you assess?
So
On that question, we're going to break here this part one on business leadership for CFOs as part of our functional department leadership series. We'll pick up with more Q&A in part two. But if anything we've talked about so far resonates with you, if you're curious about executive coaching with Randall or how to better align your team with leadership retreat, to reach out, we'd be happy to answer your questions and share resources. If you'd like to email us, info@randallcraig.com or book a call at www.randallcraig.net/30. We'll see you back for part two.